All right, folks. Today is that sneaky Tuesday that feels like a Monday. We only have we only have a few lessons left before we are halfway through with math this year. We will be finished with this first book and we'll be on to our second book. So next week you will have your Unit 4 test. Some of the things that we've learned in Unit 4, we learned how to multiply normal double-digit numbers. We've learned how to multiply by powers of 10 with the scientific notation, so 10 to the third power. We know how to multiply and we know how to multiply powers of 10 and a trick to do with the zeros. And we also know how to multiply triple-digit numbers. Here's your challenge question, but most importantly, know how to do these four. That tells me you're right on track. So today we're going to talk about rounding. So we're going to work on rounding numbers. And remember, we've already talked about rounding. The difference today is we're going to round and estimate with multiplication. So just to review, why do we round? Well, we round because sometimes we get some disgusting numbers. For example, if you have 4 divided by 3, that answer is actually going to go on forever. It's going to be 1.333333333333333 forever. And the threes will never stop. So we have to round in math in order to work with certain numbers and for different reasons you're going to round. For example, if you were dealing with money, you would round because there's nothing smaller than a penny with money. So we have rounding versus estimating, okay? So let's just look at an example of rounding. We have this difficult number such as 12 and 6,548 10,000ths. There we go. So we could look at this amount right here and we could turn it into hundredths. Now, if we're turning it into hundredths, that means that we are going to cut it off at hundredths. For example, if we were dealing with money, we would round it to the nearest hundredths because there's nothing smaller than a hundredth. The hundredths is pennies. If this was money, it'd be $12.65. Now, when you round to hundredths, you have to look at the first number going away in the thousandths place. Is it big enough to give this one more hundredth? And that answer is no, it's only a 4, so this would be 12 and 6500. What if we took this exact same amount and rounded it to the nearest tenths place instead? Would it be, is it closer to 12.6 or is it closer to 12.7? Well, the first thing that would be going away is a 5. So that actually tells me it's closer to 12 and 7/10 than it would be to 12 and 6/10. What about if you're rounding to the nearest 1? Let's say this is money, and you're saying, well, how many dollars is it closest to? Well, right now it's 12. The first thing going away is a 6. Does that mean it's closer to 13, or is it closer to 12? It actually is closer to 13. And then this exact same amount rounded to the nearest tens, if I'm counting by $10 bills, it would be closer to 10. Well, why do we round? Well, this is why we round. What if we were multiplying something difficult and we just wanted to estimate an answer? Well, let's look at if we were to multiply 12 and 6,548 10,000ths. Well, we would want to round this disgusting amount, and we could either round it to the nearest ones and then multiply it in our head, or round it to the nearest tens. Now, we know that multiplying to the nearest tens is easier than multiplying to the nearest ones. So I would say 10 times 5 is 50. So my estimation here would be 50, and that's because I took this disgusting number, rounded it to the nearest tens place, and then I went ahead and just multiplied 10 by 5. So a lot of the times when you estimate, you're going to want to just take the number and turn it into the nearest tens, because we know how easy it can be to multiply by tens. So go to page 175, and we are going to work through the odds together, and then we'll do the evens during our live session, and then whatever we do not get to will be homework today. So number 1 says round 42 to the nearest 10. Which 10 is it closer? So they actually give us a really nice looking visual here. Is 42 closer to 40 or 50? Well, the middle would be 45, and 42 is obviously closer to 40, so 40 is our answer. And then what about 86 hundredths? If we're rounding it to the nearest tens place, is it closer to 8 tenths or 9 tenths? And once again, they draw us a nice graphic. Is 86 hundredths closer to 9 tenths or 8 tenths? And that answer, as you can see it peeking out here, is 9 tenths. All right. Now let's go to number 5. Number 5 says round to the nearest 10. Round to the nearest 10. Notice it's not tenths, it's 10. So if you're counting by tens, is it closer to 40 or 50? Well, 46 is closer to 50. And remember, the way that you figure this out is you look at the first number that's going away, the ones. If it's 5 or bigger, you're going to round up. And if it's smaller than 5, then you're just going to, continue to keep the 4, and it would have been 40, right? Let's look at number 7, 85. Ooh, that's an example of it being right in between 80 and 90. And when it's perfectly in between, you round up. Let's look at 231 rounded to the nearest 100. Well, right now it's 231. So is it closer to 200 or 300? 200. What about number 11? Is number 11, so we're still rounding the nearest 100. Right now it's 800. And remember, the first thing you do is you look at the first number going bye-bye, and that tells you to round up or down. First number going bye-bye is a 9, which tells us it's so much closer to 900 than 800. So that's 900. And then we have 73 hundredths. Now we're rounding this number to the nearest tenths place. So when we round it to the nearest tenths place, this is the tenths place. So is it closer to 0.7 or 0.8? Well, this one is close to 7 tenths. What about over here? It's 15 hundredths. Is it closer to 1/10 or is it closer to 2/10? It's closer to 2/10 because it's a 5, and a 5 is exactly in between. And then rounding to the nearest hundredths. Remember, if you ever forget where they are, you could put a 1.000, and this is kind of the trick to figuring out what each one's called. So this looks like 1,000, so this place is the thousandths place. This looks like 100. If you were to ignore this 0 and just look at this, it looks like 100, so it's the hundredths place. That looks like a 10, so this is the tenths place. Okay, so that's a trick in how to remember what each spot, each value to the right of the decimal is. But put 1.0000000, and then just read that number. Whatever that number's read as, that's the name of that spot. So rounding to the nearest hundredths place is the second digit after the decimal. And the reason it's called a hundredths is because in order to make one of these, it would take 100 of this right here to make one whole. So it's 100, just like a fraction. So rounding to the nearest hundredths place, is it closer to 53 or 54? Well, that one's closer to 53 hundredths. Is this closer to 78 or 79 hundredths? This is closer to 79 hundredths. And then what is the greatest decimal in the hundredths that can be rounded to 14.5? Ooh, so 14 point something something. Well, this is actually, a lot of people would think, oh, 14.49 is the biggest thing that could be rounded to the nearest, rounded to 14 5/10. However, if you think about it, 14 and 54 hundredths would also be rounded to the nearest, would be rounded to 14.5 if we rounded it to nearest tenths. So, oh, I'm doing number 22. Mr. Stahl, come on, man. What is the greatest whole number that can be rounded to 30? Well, same idea. It could be rounded down to 30 if it's 34. And then what's the smallest? Well, 25 could be rounded up to 30. So 34 and 25. And then finally, 176, it says explore estimation in multiplication. Okay, so for each, we are going to round these numbers, which are called factors, because the numbers you multiply together are called factors. We are going to try to figure out how to do this, to estimate this mentally. And you could go a couple different ways, because you could round to the nearest ones, the nearest tens, the nearest hundreds. But here, I would suggest rounding them both to the nearest tens to make it the easiest. So 24 would be rounded to 20, and 39 would be rounded to 40, and 20 times 40, ignore the zeros, 4 times 2 is 8, and then add the zeros. So that would be 800. What about here? Well, there's a couple different ways you could do it. I would suggest rounding each to the nearest tens place. So this would be 0.7. This would be 0.2. And 0.7 times 0.2 would be, well, you ignore the decimal. 7 times 2 is 14, right? Let me write it over here. 7 times 2 is 14. And then you have to bring the decimal back. Well, there's one number after the decimal, and one number after the decimal. So bring them both back, and it would be 0.14. But there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. I mean, no one's telling you you have to round each to the nearest tens place. You could have said this is close to 1, and 1 times 0.2 is 0.2. So you could have said it's 2/10 as your estimated answer, and that would make total sense to me. So there's a lot of wiggle room when estimating, because estimating is just a way for you to figure out what's close to the real answer. And then for number 27, it says, is there more than one way to round these numbers? And you don't have to write this, because I just gave you that answer. Yes, there's a whole bunch of different ways to round the numbers, right? You can not round one of them to the nearest ones. All you're doing is you're making these numbers a little easier so you could do the math in your head. Okay, and there's many, many, many different ways to make these numbers easier. You could round to the nearest wholes, tens, tenths, hundreds. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do it, and there's not one right way to estimate. And why are some closer to the real answer? Well, it depends what you are using to estimate. If you estimate both of these to the nearest tenths, then you're going to get one answer, right? This is an example of rounding each to the nearest tenths. If you round each to the nearest whole number, this would be 1, and this would be 0, and 1 times 0 is 0. Now, if you round to the nearest ones, then that's not as specific as rounding to the nearest tenths. So the more specific you round each number, the closer you'll get to the real answer. And then the less specific, which you guys know what I mean by specific, then the further away than you are from the real answer. Okay, so that is what I have for you for the video. That's what I have for you for this video. So now what you are going to do is go ahead and practice some of these, and I will see you at our live session at 10:30. We'll go over some more, and what we do not get to will be homework. All right. I will see you guys at 10:30.